Millions will watch America collapse this fall. And I want you to notice the word watch, because that is the part almost nobody is prepared for. Not participate. Not fight. Watch. Because what is coming is not the kind of collapse that arrives with tanks in the street and a single dramatic morning that everyone remembers forever. It is the kind that unfolds on the screen in your hand. One push notification at a time. A bank you never heard of freezing withdrawals. A number on a chart that does something it has never done in your lifetime. A headline your parents would have called impossible. Scrolling past between a cooking video and an ad. And the most disturbing part, the part that should genuinely unsettle you, is that the people who move real money for a living have already seen it coming and quietly repositioned, while you were told, gently and repeatedly, that everything was under control. This fall, the gap between what they know and what you were told is going to close, violently, in public, in real time. And millions of Americans are going to watch it happen on the same phones they were doom-scrolling on the night before, wondering how nobody warned them, when the truth is the warnings were everywhere, buried in reports written in language designed to keep you calm. The number that actually matters is not the $39 trillion federal debt everyone argues about on the news. It is the $98.8 trillion in total American debt that nobody mentions, because when you add up everything the country owes, it equals 324% of the entire economy. And that is the load-bearing down on this fall. Everyone fixates on the federal debt, the $39 trillion number that gets shouted about on cable news every night. And while you were watching that one number, the far more dangerous one was quietly assembled behind your back. Because the federal debt is only one leg of the structure. When you add up everything America actually owes, the government debt plus corporate debt from both financial and non-financial companies plus household debt, the credit cards and mortgages and auto loans and student loans, the total reached $98.8 trillion in the second quarter of 2025, equal to 324% of the entire GDP of the United States. The country owes more than 3 times everything it produces in a year, and that ratio is the highest in American history, built up steadily from around $50 trillion in 2008 to nearly $98 trillion now, doubling in less than 2 decades. And here is why this is a fall problem and not a someday problem. Because debt this size does not sit quietly. It demands to be serviced, and servicing it means interest payments, and interest payments are now consuming the country alive. Billionaire investor Ray Dalio, who built the largest hedge fund in the world, and who has spent his career studying exactly how great powers collapse under debt, issued his most severe warning yet, likening America's situation to an approaching economic heart attack. His words, not mine. He said the country is spending 40% more than it takes in, that this is a chronic condition, and that the debt service payments are squeezing away the country's buying power like plaque building up in the arteries. And everyone who has ever watched someone have a heart attack knows the terrible thing about arterial plaque. It builds silently for years, while the person feels fine, and then one ordinary afternoon, without warning, the artery closes and everything stops at once. That is the mechanism sitting under this fall. And the reason millions will watch rather than prepare is that this number, the real $98.8 trillion number, almost never appears on the screens where Americans get their information, because the story of the federal debt alone is frightening enough to fill the news cycle, and the total picture is considered too alarming to show. So the corporate debt piled higher, the household debt climbed to record levels, and the interest on all of it began compounding into a weight that the economy now has to carry into the most fragile season of the year, with a weakened labor market underneath it, a stock market inflated by a single AI bet balanced on top of it, and a government that has already admitted it has no room left to borrow its way out. When Dalio talks about a heart attack, he is not being poetic. He is describing what happens when an economy that owes 324% of its output meets a shock it cannot absorb, and the tools that saved it last time, borrowing trillions to paper over the wound, are gone. Because you cannot borrow your way out of a debt crisis when the debt itself is the crisis. This fall, that arithmetic stops being theoretical and starts being personal, arriving in the price of everything you buy and the value of everything you have saved. The rest of the world has quietly stopped trusting the American dollar, and the proof is not an opinion. It is written in gold and in treasury bonds, because central banks are dumping the American debt they once hoarded and buying gold at a pace not seen since the 1970s, and this fall is when that silent vote becomes impossible to ignore. Watch what the world's central banks are doing with their money rather than what anyone is saying, because money moving is the only vote that cannot lie, and the vote being cast right now is a vote of no confidence in the United States. Gold just crossed $4,500 an ounce, the highest price in human history, up more than 50% in a matter of months. And the World Gold Council pointed out the detail that should chill anyone who understands markets, that gold surged even while real interest rates rose and the dollar strengthened, conditions that are supposed to push gold down, not up. When an asset climbs while every force that normally suppresses it is pushing the other way, it is telling you that something the models cannot capture is happening underneath, and the World Gold Council named it plainly, saying the market is now pricing in a systemic monetary breakdown, not inflation, not a normal recession. A breakdown of the monetary system itself, and the buyers driving this are not nervous retail investors. They are central banks, the most sophisticated money managers on the planet, accumulating gold on a scale not seen since the 1970s. China alone raised its official gold reserves to 2,303 tons by September, climbing relentlessly year after year, while at the very same time slashing its holdings of American Treasury bonds from a peak of $1.3 trillion down to $730 billion. The lowest level since 2009, as read those two moves together, because together they tell a story that neither one tells alone. The largest holder of American debt on Earth is simultaneously dumping American promises and hoarding physical gold, which is exactly what a country does when it has quietly decided that the paper it has been holding is no longer safe. And this is not one country acting alone. It is a global reallocation, central banks around the world voting with their reserves, moving out of paper claims on America and into hard metal they can hold in a vault, Hartachik and the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget itself laid out what happens if this accelerates, describing a currency crisis where the dollar faces sudden and significant depreciation and a financial crisis where reduced confidence in treasury markets leads to a spike in interest rates, panic among traders, and the failure of key financial institutions. Here is why the fall is the pressure point. The American government has to constantly sell new treasury bonds to roll over its enormous debt, and it depends on the world showing up to buy them. But if the world is backing away, as the gold and the dumping already show, then the government has to offer higher and higher interest rates to attract buyers, and higher rates on $39 trillion of federal debt means the interest bill explodes, which forces more borrowing, which spooks buyers further, which is the exact doom loop that ends in a failed treasury auction. The single event that professional investors fear most, because it is the moment the world publicly refuses to lend America money at any reasonable price. Millions will watch this unfold as a series of headlines about bond yields they were taught to ignore, never realizing that the boring number climbing on the screen is the sound of the entire post-war financial order, the one that made American life affordable, quietly coming apart, one auction at a time, this fall. The money you were told was safe is trapped inside a shadow banking system you have never heard of, and the first funds have already slammed the doors shut, freezing investors out of their own cash. Because the great private credit bubble has officially started to pop, and almost no one watching the news even knows it exists. There is an entire financial universe operating in the shadows behind the banks you can see, and this fall is when it starts to crack in public, and the terrifying part is how few people even know it is there. It is called private credit, a $1.7 trillion mountain of loans made not by regulated banks, but by investment firms operating with almost no oversight. And for years, these firms sold ordinary people a seductive promise that they could earn the high, stable yields of private equity while keeping the ability to pull their money out whenever they wanted. The liquidity of a public stock, that promise was a lie built into the structure itself, a fundamental mismatch, because the loans these funds make are locked up for years while the investors were told they could leave any time. And everyone in the industry knew that the moment enough people tried to leave at once, the doors would have to close. This year, the doors started closing. Investment behemoths managing these flagship private credit funds activated what are called redemption gates, a clinical term for a brutal reality, that when investors asked for their own money back, they were told no, the fund is frozen, you cannot withdraw. The Fulcrum described this as the definitive popping of a massive asset class bubble and the end of the reckless era of democratizing private equity, and the American Prospect went further, publishing an investigation titled The Private Credit Cartels, exposing how concentrated and interconnected this hidden system has become. And here is why this is a fall detonation and not a contained problem. Private credit did not stay in its lane. It became the financing engine behind the entire AI infrastructure boom, funding the data centers and the chip build-outs at firms that the Fulcrum specifically named as already overextended. Companies like Oracle and CoreWeave leaning on debt to build the very AI capacity the stock market is betting everything on. So the two biggest bubbles of this era, the AI stock mania and the private credit shadow banking bubble, are not separate. They are wired together, each one holding the other up, which means when one wobbles this fall, it pulls the other down with it. And private credit is riskier still, because as the fulcrum noted, when a company finances itself through private credit rather than traditional banks, it often signals that the normal lenders already said no, that the borrower was too risky for regulated finance, which means this hidden system is stuffed with exactly the loans most likely to go bad in a downturn. Now picture the fall scenario. The labor market weakens. Some of these overextended borrowers miss payments. The funds face a wave of investors trying to get out at once. More gates slam shut. And suddenly ordinary Americans who were told their retirement money was earning safe, steady returns discover it is frozen inside a fund they cannot exit, in a system nobody regulated, connected to an AI bubble that is deflating at the same moment. Millions will watch this unfold as strange headlines about funds they never invested in directly, never realizing that their pension, their 401k, their insurance policy quietly bought into the shadow world years ago, and that the safety they were promised was always an illusion waiting for the season. It would finally break. Your home is about to become the first thing. The collapse takes, not because you cannot pay the mortgage, but because the insurance companies are quietly retreating from entire states, and a home nobody will insure is a home nobody can sell, which means your single largest asset can become worthless overnight through no fault of your own. Consider the possibility almost no homeowner has prepared for, that you could lose everything you built without ever missing a single payment, simply because the company that insures your house decides your entire region is no longer worth the risk. This is already happening, quietly, state by state, and it accelerates into this fall as the peak of hurricane and wildfire season collides with an insurance industry that is in full retreat. The largest insurers in America have been pulling out of entire states, refusing to write new policies and quietly declining to renew existing ones. In California, in Florida, in Louisiana, and increasingly in states nobody associates with disaster, because climate-driven storms have broken the actuarial math that the entire insurance industry runs on. And here is the chain reaction that turns an insurance problem into a collapse of your personal wealth, a chain most people never see until they are caught in it. A mortgage requires insurance. Every lender demands it. So if you cannot get insurance, you cannot get a mortgage. And if a buyer cannot get a mortgage, they cannot buy your house. Which means the moment insurers abandon your area, the pool of people who can purchase your home shrinks towards zero. And a house that cannot be sold is a house whose value collapses, not because of anything you did, but because the financial infrastructure underneath it quietly withdrew. In Louisiana, 30 to 40% of mortgage applications have already been failing specifically because of insurance costs. Not credit, not income, insurance. And that is the leading edge of a wave moving inland. First Street's risk modeling estimated that tens of millions of American homes are currently insured at prices that do not remotely reflect their actual risk, meaning tens of millions of families believe they are protected while sitting on a policy that is either about to be canceled or about to become unaffordable. And a congressional committee has already used the words full-scale financial crisis to describe this, comparing it directly to the 2008 housing collapse, except this time, the trigger is not a mortgage instrument. Nobody understood. It is the physical reality that insurers can no longer afford to cover the homes Americans live in. The fall is the pressure point, because it is the height of catastrophe season, when a single major hurricane or wildfire can push a wobbling insurer into insolvency, and when an insurer fails, every policy it held evaporates at once, leaving thousands of families instantly uninsured, instantly unable to sell, instantly watching their largest asset become a liability. Millions will watch this arrive as a slow-motion tragedy in their own neighborhoods, the for-sale signs that never come down, the neighbor who cannot leave, the quiet realization that the house they spent 30 years paying off has become something they cannot escape and cannot sell, an anchor instead of a nest egg. In the exact season the storms come to test which homes the system has already decided to abandon. The pension that millions of retired Americans were promised is sitting on a foundation of the exact assets that are about to crack, because the funds that owe teachers and firefighters and nurses their retirement poured their money into private credit, commercial real estate, and the AI-inflated market. And this fall is when those bets come due. Think about who is actually standing on the thin ice this fall, because it is not only the traders and the speculators, it is the retired teacher in Ohio, the former firefighter in Illinois, the nurse who spent 30 years in a hospital believing her pension was a promise carved in stone. Public and private pension funds across America manage the retirement savings of tens of millions of workers, and in their desperate hunt for returns high enough to cover what they owe, those funds quietly poured enormous sums into exactly the assets described throughout this video. The private credit that is now freezing behind redemption gates, the commercial real estate that is rotting as offices sit empty, and the AI-concentrated stock market that the Federal Reserve itself has flagged as an unresolved danger. Pension funds were desperate for yield because they are structurally underfunded. They have promised more in future benefits than they can cover with safe, conservative investments. So for years, they reached further and further out onto the risk curve, chasing the higher returns that private credit and real estate and tech stocks promised, telling themselves and their retirees that the strategy was sound. And now every one of those bets is exposed at the same time, in the same season, because the private credit is gating. The commercial real estate is facing a refinancing wall at doubled interest rates, and the AI market is heading into an earnings season that will test whether the valuations were ever real. When those assets fall together, and they are correlated in ways the pension managers pretended they were not, the funds take losses on multiple fronts at once, and a pension fund that suffers deep enough losses cannot simply wait for a recovery, because it has checks to write every single month to people who have already retired and have no other income. That is the trap. A pension that loses 20 or 30% of its value in a market crash while still owing full benefits to current retirees faces an impossible arithmetic. And the historical response has always been the same: benefit cuts, contribution increases on current workers, and desperate pleas for government bailouts that, as this video has already shown, the government no longer has the room to provide. And the timing is cruel, because retirees are the least able to absorb a shock. They are done working. They cannot rebuild. They cannot wait a decade for the market to come back. They need the check this month and the next month and every month after. Millions of Americans who did everything right, who worked their careers on the promise of a secure retirement, will watch this fall as the funds holding their future report losses across every asset class at once. And they will realize that the promise they were made was quietly gambled away in a search for yield they never authorized and never understood, on assets that were all, secretly, the same bet in different costumes, waiting for the season they would all come due together. The man being handed control of the Federal Reserve this year was in the room during the last collapse, and the advice he gave then was to bail out Wall Street at no cost to Wall Street, which means the referee who decides whether you get rescued this fall has already shown you exactly whose side he is on. History does not just rhyme this time, it is being run by some of the same hands, and almost nobody has connected the disturbing dots. The man widely reported to be taking control of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, is not a newcomer to financial crises. He was a Fed governor during the 2008 collapse. He was in the room when the biggest decisions were made, and the American Prospect documented exactly what he advocated for back then, that when Merrill Lynch and AIG were going under in September 2008, Warsh's advice to Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke was for a pure bailout with no costs to Wall Street, and that advice was taken again and again, becoming the essence of the entire crisis response. Sit with what that means as he prepares to take the chair for the next one. The person about to hold the most powerful economic lever in the country, the one who decides who gets rescued and who gets left to drown when the collapse comes, has a documented record of using that lever to shield Wall Street completely, while ordinary Americans absorb the damage through lost homes and lost jobs and a decade of stagnation. And he is arriving into the role under a president who has stated openly, repeatedly, that his Fed chair must sharply lower interest rates on command, which means the independence that is supposed to make the Fed a neutral referee is being stripped away at the exact moment the referee is being handed to someone with a history of favoring the powerful. This is the part that should genuinely disturb you, because it changes what the fall collapse will actually look like for you specifically. When the private credit funds freeze and the regional banks wobble and the pension losses mount, there will be a decision made about who the Federal Reserve moves to protect, and the record suggests the answer will be the same as it was in 2008, the large financial institutions. The Wall Street firms, the systemically important players, rescued first and rescued fully, while the freeze in your money market account, the collapse in your home value, the losses in your pension are treated as acceptable collateral damage. And cutting interest rates aggressively into an economy where inflation is still running near 3%, which is exactly what this new chair is expected to do, does not save you. It accelerates the erosion of the dollar in your pocket, making the groceries and the rent and the gas climb faster, while telling you it is medicine. The American Prospect put it starkly, that in the coming crisis, the Fed is not likely to be in good hands. Millions will watch this fall as the Federal Reserve announces emergency measures and special facilities and liquidity injections, and the financial press will describe it in soothing, technical language about stabilizing markets. And most Americans will never understand that they are watching the same movie play out that played in 2008, the one where the institutions that caused the crisis are made whole with the public's money while the public is handed the bill. Run this time by a man who already showed everyone, 17 years ago, exactly which side of that transaction he believes you belong on. When the money stops making sense, people do not stay calm. They look for someone to blame, and every historian who studies collapse will tell you the same chilling thing. That financial breakdown and political violence arrive together, and this fall is delivering the financial breakdown into the angriest America in living memory. Watch what happens to a society, not just an economy, when the financial foundation gives way, because the collapse this video describes does not stay politely inside the markets. It spills into the streets, and the historical record on this is grimly consistent. The fulcrum, analyzing the mood heading into this period, laid out the pattern that political scientists have documented across centuries, that when younger generations perceive the economic system as closed to them, support for disruptive and populist movements rises, and that periods of blocked economic opportunity have coincided with waves of political upheaval. Again and again, the populist movements of the late 19th century, the upheaval of the Great Depression, the unrest of the late 1960s, all of them erupting when economic expectations collided with structural limits. And here is what makes this fall uniquely combustible, because the financial breakdown is landing on a country that is already primed for detonation before a single bank fails. Global risk analysts ranked the United States among the highest risk nations on Earth for civil unrest heading into this period. 70% of Americans have told pollsters the American dream is dead or was never real. Trust in every institution, Congress, the media, the courts, has fallen to the lowest levels ever recorded. And the country is more heavily armed and more politically divided than at any point since the Civil War. Now pour a financial collapse into that. When the pension checks shrink, when the home values crater, when the money market account freezes, when the grocery bill doubles while the paycheck vanishes, the abstract anger that already fills the country acquires a target and a trigger. The fulcrum warned that dissatisfaction with policy outcomes gradually becomes dissatisfaction with the structures that produce those outcomes, which is the academic way of saying that people stop being angry about their bills and start being angry about the entire system. And a population that has lost faith in the system while losing its money at the same time is the raw material of genuine upheaval. And the fall is historically when this ignites, because economic pain that builds through a hard year tends to boil over as the holidays approach, and the weather turns, and the gap between what people have and what the season demands becomes unbearable. Millions will watch this fall as protests they were told were isolated grow into something sustained, as the anger that has been simmering under the surface of ordinary American life for years finally finds the spark that the financial collapse provides. And the most disturbing part is that the people who study this professionally are not describing a remote possibility. They are describing a pattern so reliable across history that its absence would be the surprise, not its arrival. And it is arriving into the most divided, most armed, most distrustful America that has existed in the lifetime of anyone watching this. Take every hidden fuse in this video and lay them on one calendar, and you will see the thing the experts never show you because each one guards only their own corner. That all of these are not separate crises at all. They are connected wires running back to a single bomb, and they are all timed to the same fall. Here is the exercise that reveals the true shape of what is coming, the one no analyst will ever perform for you, because each of them is paid to watch only a single wire, never the whole bomb. Lay them side by side on one calendar and watch the pattern emerge. The $98.8 trillion debt load bearing down on an economy that owes 3 times what it produces. The world's central banks dumping American treasuries and fleeing into gold, pricing in a systemic monetary breakdown. The private credit shadow banking system already slamming its redemption gates shut, wired directly into the AI bubble that props up the entire stock market. The insurance industry retreating from entire states as catastrophe season peaks, turning homes into unsellable anchors. The pension funds holding all of these cracking bets at once for tens of millions of retirees. The Federal Reserve being handed to a man with a documented record of rescuing Wall Street and abandoning everyone else, arriving just in time to decide who gets saved. And the historical certainty that financial collapse and political violence arrive together, landing on the most divided and heavily armed America in living memory. Now, see the thing that should genuinely change how you feel, because these are not 7 separate problems that happen to share a season. They are one problem wearing 7 masks. The debt requires constant borrowing, which requires the world to keep buying treasuries, which is why the central banks fleeing to gold matters. The AI bubble is financed by the private credit that is freezing, which is held by the pensions that are cracking, which is regulated by the Fed that is being captured. The insurance collapse crushes the home values that are the last asset ordinary families have, right as their pensions and their savings crack simultaneously. Every wire runs back to the same core, An economy that borrowed and inflated and gambled its way to a structure that only holds as long as confidence holds, and confidence is the one thing that vanishes all at once, not gradually. That is the terror the experts cannot say out loud, because saying it would trigger the very panic that collapses the structure. None of this was coordinated by a single hand in a single room, and that is worse, not better, because a conspiracy can be exposed and stopped, but this is emergent. Dozens of separate actors, each optimizing their own corner. None of them responsible for the whole, none of them asking what happens when every wire is live at once, in the same season, on the same exhausted country. Nobody asked that question because it was nobody's job to ask it. And so the fuses were laid, one by one, year by year, all quietly converging on a single fall, and millions will watch them ignite in sequence, each one setting off the next, wondering how the whole thing could come apart so fast. Never understanding that it was always one bomb, that it was always wired together, and that the only thing holding it inert was a confidence that this fall is finally scheduled to break. The government that rescued the country in 2008 and again in 2020 has quietly written down, in a document almost no one has read, that it cannot do it a third time, which means when millions watch the collapse this fall, they will be watching without the safety net every American assumes will always be there. Somewhere in the back of your mind sits the same assumption nearly every American carries without ever examining it, that no matter how bad it gets, the government will do what it has always done, step in, print the money, write the checks, and catch the country before it hits the ground. Let that belief die now, tonight, before the fall arrives, because the institution whose entire job is to plan for this has already put it in writing that the net is gone. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan watchdog run by former directors of the Congressional Budget Office from both parties, published its analysis of what a fiscal crisis would actually look like, and it read like a catalog of everything in this video arriving at once. A financial crisis where confidence in treasury markets collapses and interest rates spike and key institutions fail. An inflation crisis where the attempt to paper over the debt sends prices spiraling. A currency crisis where the dollar suddenly and significantly depreciates. And a default crisis where the government explicitly or implicitly fails to pay what it owes. Those are their categories, their words, their scenarios, published in careful institutional language and then buried where almost no one would read them. And the reason the net is gone comes down to arithmetic that cannot be argued with. In 2008, the government deployed roughly $1.8 trillion to stop the collapse, and it worked partly because the national debt was around 64% of the economy, low enough that the world lent the money without hesitation. In 2020, it spent roughly $5 trillion, and even at a debt near 100% of the economy, the borrowing still cleared. But the debt now sits far higher. The total obligations of the country have reached 324% of everything it produces. The annual interest bill alone has crossed $1 trillion, and the CRFB stated plainly that a shock arriving on top of this debt makes the old playbook unusable, because you cannot borrow another $5 trillion when the world is already backing away from your bonds without triggering the exact panic you are trying to prevent. So the emergency response this time will not be rescue, it will be the opposite, and the watchdog spelled it out: sharp tax increases and spending cuts. An austerity crisis that undermines demand and pushes the economy into a deeper recession, freezes on Social Security and Medicare, and every program the vulnerable depend on. That is the plan. Not a stimulus check. Not a bailout for you. Austerity delivered to a population already on its knees. Millions will watch this fall waiting for the announcement that help is coming, refreshing the news for word of the rescue package that always arrived before, and the most disturbing realization of the entire collapse will be the slow understanding that this time the announcement is not coming, that the cavalry they were counting on reviewed the situation years ago, concluded it could no longer afford to ride, and quietly wrote its surrender into a document it hoped no one would read until it was already too late to matter. I am not going to close this by handing you 3 easy steps to survive, because what you just watched is not a storm you can buy supplies for, and the single most disturbing truth of this entire video is that you will watch it happen on the same screen you are watching me on right now, and you will recognize every single piece as it arrives. For the length of this entire video, I have not handed you a single opinion, and that is the part 1 need you to carry with you when you close this and go back to your evening. Because everything I described came from the people whose entire careers depend on being right rather than being dramatic. From Ray Dalio, who built the largest hedge fund on Earth, from the World Gold Council, from the Federal Reserve's own stability reports, from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, from the reporting of the Fulcrum and the American Prospect, none of them fringe voices, all of them pointing without coordinating at the same narrow season. And the title of this video was never meant as a metaphor. Millions really will watch, because that is precisely how a modern collapse arrives. Not as a single cinematic moment, but as a feed, a stream of push notifications you scroll past between an ad and a video. A private credit fund freezing on a Tuesday. A regional bank you never heard of failing on a Thursday. A treasury auction going badly on a Friday afternoon while you are thinking about the weekend. Gold spiking to a number that makes no sense. A headline about civil unrest in a city you have driven through. Each piece arriving alone, each one explained away in calm official language, until one day you look up and realize the ground that was under your feet a year ago is simply gone. I am not telling you this to sell you a bunker or a gold coin or a survival course, and I am not going to insult you with 3 tidy steps to protect yourself from a systemic collapse that no individual checklist can stop. I am telling you this for one reason only, that you have spent this year feeling a dread you could not name, sensing that something under ordinary life had come loose, wondering if you were the only one who could feel it, while everyone on your screen insisted the economy was fine. And I need you to know before the fall arrives that you were not paranoid, you were not negative, you were not broken. You were early. The people who move real money already moved it. The central banks already fled to gold. The insiders already repositioned while you were told to stay calm. And when the pieces in this video begin to arrive one after another in the order I laid them out, you will feel a strange and terrible recognition, the recognition of someone who was warned, who saw the shape of it before it came, and the only thing I can give you, the only honest thing, is that clarity itself, the refusal to be surprised, the ability to look at what is coming and name it out loud while everyone around you is still pretending. That is not much, but in a fall like the one that is coming, it is the one thing they cannot take from you, and it is the reason you watched all the way to the end.